Our first presentation tonight is entitled, All the Single Ladies, Why Celibacy is Superior to Marriage. Please welcome Shey Margrave.
Growing up, I was surrounded by what my parents sought to teach me, how to live a good Christian life. And I never objected to this. It seemed great to me. Friends my age, people I didn't have to try to impress, a family. I was also like every other kid my age, a bit grossed out with my parents' PDA, which they always seemed to find funny. However, as I grew older, things changed. While I was still grossed out by anything romantic, people were now starting to talk about the new boy, or whatever they were doing. I just didn't get it. So I stepped back and observed, and did find some things. A normality to romance for teens, protective fathers, chatty mothers, with all eyes on their own teenagers, who are just trying to understand how to live. And the cycle continued. Sure, the young adults could now be a sort of guide for the next generation, but they had their own problems in college too. Ring by spring culture shows the pressure that is put onto young adults for the choice of marriage. However, choice is now seen as, in this context, singleness as a time of waiting, and marriage as your real adult life. But what in history has caused this? And what has the church had to say about it? Well, the history of the church has constantly defined celibacy as an intentional abstinence from sex in order to have a better spiritual life. Our best example from history is of monks. They were highly regarded for over a millennia based on their acts of denying the flesh in order to serve God. This caused them to have a higher mentality when they had their service to God. However, Protestant leaders argued that no one could deny the flesh, which goes against Paul's own arguments. They argued that no one is capable of denying lust. Although marriage is a respected and blessed tradition in the church, I argue that for Christians, celibacy is superior based on its higher spirituality, depth with community, and significance in the New Testament. Marriage has been defined as two people to one flesh, or full devotion to your spouse. However, with this full devotion, your mind will constantly be split between the church and your spouse. Christian values, based on what Jesus and Paul have taught us, should be growing the body and spreading the gospel. This has been outlined, but it is not what we see today. Paul argues in 1 Corinthians 7 his ideal lifestyle with or without marriage, but he mainly argues that all should be like him, or unmarried. With this as our set outline, as well as the ability to look through the long history of the church, we are able to see how we are supposed to live. Firstly, the Old Testament. The Old Testament shows command after command pointing to the necessity of marriage. People point to Adam and Eve as the starting point of the blessed tradition of marriage. However, there is no necessity to marriage until the Mosaic Covenant. The Mosaic Covenant outlines for Israelites that they had to follow physical guidelines in order to fall under a physical blessing. And this could only be followed through with their physical descendants. With this requirement, single people, at the time known as eunuchs or castrated men, were forced out of the community. Later, we see our own history, a post-Messiah world, and no physical requirements under Christians today, such as these. And not only do we live in a post-Messiah world, but we have our Messiah, Jesus' own example to follow. Jesus then outlines how eunuchs, who were an outcasted race at the time of the Israelites, are now a higher society. In Matthew 19:12, he states the three types of eunuchs: those who are born eunuchs, those who are made eunuchs, and those who are eunuchs for the kingdom of God. This higher standard has been constantly seen through the history of the church and translates into some things we see today. Eunuchs translated then into monasticism, or being a monk. The monks were highly regarded, not only for their acts of denying the flesh, but especially since sex was seen as evil, unless for procreation. Where does that leave us today? The monks followed God's commands and wanted to follow Jesus' own example. Jesus is our example for spiritual and physical lifestyle. Jesus is our example of this lifestyle based on his importance set on community, and as well as his sayings, like in Mark 12:25, that we will become like the angels. We will neither be given nor have marriage. While the body and Jesus' relationship will be signified as a marriage, it will no longer be for individual people. So marriage is not a lifelong thing. It will end at eternity. Paul states many of his arguments for singleness in 1 Corinthians. He says things including, "It is better for a man not to touch a woman." With this, he sees a single devotion in your life to serving God, rather than having split devotion with a spouse. This not only deepens your communal bonds, but also gives you a chance to have further spirituality. Paul sees this as the one constant way to live your life the best possible. And his example is carried out again by the history of the monks. With their full devotion to God, they had a high standing and full devotion to charity, God's love. This charity is important to every single Christian's lifestyle. However, it is more significant in the single person's lifestyle based on their ability to fully follow God's charity, God's plan for our individual lives. Singleness is heightening today, but only in the secular world. But we cannot follow their own arguments for this. We have the ability to follow God-given commands about a single life. We as Christians not only should enforce singleness in the church by giving messages for them, but we should also continue to preach for marriage. Both of these together is the best way for the church to continue. With giving messages for married people as well as celibates, we are able to give every single Christian a way to follow the narrow path God has given us. Thank you.